No, I appreciate that, Mary. And I mean, I know young adults who've been, grew up in the church, and they're 30 years old, they're single, they're working, they're, don't have children. And it's hard for them to come to church because the same three questions are always asked.
Yes.
Yeah.
What are the three questions?
Oh, it's basically, are you seeing anybody? How's school going? Or, what do you do for a living? So you're kind of reduced to a career as well. And then, when you're going to have kids or those kinds of things.
Matchmaking.
Matchmaking, for sure. Yeah. Yep.
What the full officer, nobody was allowed to put cohabitation because it was against the law. It was a law that you could cohabitate. So I had this guy and he had this girlfriend, he said, and she was pregnant by someone other than him. And asked by getting married, and I said, well, let's do this. I'll let you cohabitate. And then when the baby is born, we'll see if you still love her. Say if this baby is born disabled, you're still going to love her, and it's not your son. You're still going to love her like a real wife.
Mm-hmm.
I love that child. So I had to wait till the baby was born, and I gave permission to get married. So I had a little power there, but I mean, I thought it was the right thing to do at the time because it's just right.
Yeah. I suspect, we're not quite transitioning to marriage, grace and marriage, but the two are obviously related as we've discussed. It'll probably be next week when we get into parenting and the sibling life. But at the very end of this section in the book, he talks about the nuclear family. And I just want to read some of that now because I think I can copy my notes for you. It's just like quote after quote. It's not, it's as clear as English, but it's not organized super cleanly. But at the end of the section, he talks about the nuclear family. And I think sharing this is going to help sort of overarch everything about these various relationships. So he says, grace does not destroy the nuclear family. It does destroy the supremacy of the nuclear family. It reconstructs the bonds of affection between human beings on the basis of the prior grace of God to universally fallen people, rather than on the prior fact of blood relation. And then he goes on to talk about how grace, if it deconstructs the supremacy of the nuclear family, it also renders back your family, however your family looks. So that he says children are properly loved, but with a little detachment. Parents are fittingly honored, but with less suppression and resentment. Sibling rivalry is deconstructed, although that may be the last wall of Jericho to come tumbling down. The end of the absolute claim of nuclear family, for which grace strictly calls, emancipates the nuclear family from the very nerve of neurosis, which is the projection upon human beings of what belongs only to God. Translation. Translation. He's saying we have a neurosis or a neurotic kind of thing that we place on our families, an expectation that should belong to God, that our families will save us, that our families will give us our identity without fail, that our families should provide grace in all seasons and at all times, unfailingly. And so this becomes a neurosis, Why didn't my parents this? Or why doesn't my spouse that? Or why don't my kids appreciate me?
Love me,
Yeah, of course. And so grace emancipates the family from this neurosis of trying to sort of create a false religion out of your family, whether that's out of your kids or whatever. And then he says, the grace of God releases the possibility of a non-demanding love between people united by human blood. So basically, our blood relationships aren't a law that says, well, you have to love me, you're my mother. Only a mother could love those kids, that kind of a thing. But that now grace comes in and says, you are now free to love each other in your family in one direction, which means you give grace and love, not waiting or judging whether they deserve it, or will pass it back to you in a proportion equal to the love you've given to them. But grace from God through us to our family begins to put the nuclear family out of the realm of neurosis and resentment and into emancipation.
Why does it use the nuclear instead of the modern family?
Nuclear means
I don't know.
about 1.5.
Yeah, I don't
Go
know.
back to the atomic bomb?
Nuclear means.
No, nuclear means you have, the way a nucleus and an atom is constructed. It's sort of this like in my family, me and Andrea are like the center of this nucleus, and then these kids are bouncing around, and the temptation is to orbit around them instead of them orbit around us, because they're the ones that are going to go off into outer space when they're older. Yeah. So nuclear is not about a bomb, although it does end up that way sometimes.
Tom,
Not about nuclear.
Yeah. Judy, please.
what we're really talking about is interdependence in families. And, my family has always been that way because my mother was that way, my grandmother was that way. We were just raised to be interdependent in our families. We didn't depend on each other to be the people we were. And I think that's really dangerous when people think that their only connection is they have to be something to their kids or their parents or whatever, but that they need to say, I'm who I am, I'm who God created me to be, and therefore I can be for those other people whatever I'm called to be, but I'm not necessarily accountable to or responsible for. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That kind of
that's great.
relationship that doesn't require you to follow the law,
Mhm.
but to be graceful in those relationships, however they grow.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like a throwaway line when Adam and Eve get together. For this reason, a man shall leave his family. But a lot of people never leave their family psychologically. Or you get, an incomplete, immature person joining their life to another incomplete, immature person, hoping that Jerry Maguire is right, you complete me, which is nonsense. And so then you just sort of bring your family history of codependence into a marriage. The way that Zoll says it is, he says, the law weighs in with the baggage brought to the marriage relationship, the givens, the insistent archaeology on which each person's previous life stands. So he's basically saying when two people get married, they are, you get Indiana Jones marrying Indiana Jones, and they each have their archaeology of the history of the world. And it's coming into the marriage.
A lot of this is based on expectations.
Sure.
And I know a lot about some guys that I knew they were attorneys. So they went to college, because their dad went there. They went to law school because their dad was an attorney, and the expectations of the dad. When he got to be attorney, he says, no, this isn't right. I don't like this. I did all that for my dad, basically.
Martin Luther.
Yeah, Luther too.
And so a gal gets married to this guy, and she had a wonderful dad. I got to think that she's thinking this guy has to live up to her dad too. So it's a lot of it's expectations that we put on our kids or somebody puts on us.
Yeah.
So grace cures it all, right?
Yeah. Jackie, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, a lot of times we put our identity into something else. So I think, especially, I can relate to my identity was within my family for a long time. And then I think it's kind of a maturity thing or even maybe a developmental, how we develop in different ways. But yeah, the danger in putting so much into I'm talking about family of origin, that you can lose yourself and not even know who you are or who you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And if we can just keep our focus that our identity is in Jesus.
Right. Yep. You can see how this author's son in the book Seculosity writes about all the different things we've turned into religions. We're religious about food and politics and perfect parenting and taking care of the environment, and all these kinds of other things have risen to the level of what God should be. It's quite the thing.
Awesome.
Yeah. Back in the early 70s, there was a psychologist named Ernst Becker, and he wrote a book called The Denial of Death. And it's basically a book about how we are constructed to basically deny death. That's just how that's what you have to do to survive in this world. But one of the things he did, he was a Jew, but he was kind of a secular Jew. He wasn't sure there was anything out there to believe in terms of God. But one of the things he predicted in the early 70s was the rise of apocalyptic romance, in which the marriage and the wedding would take the place of God and religion in the importance of a person's life. And what he specifically predicted was the wedding industry is about to explode. The money and the detail put into the wedding and the reception and the honeymoon and the whole deal is about to explode, because he saw people were transferring from identity and a tradition, religious tradition, family expectations, to now, I'm going to find my person and we are going to produce a new religion, which is our life together, and see how that expectation holds up in practice. So,
Well, it's not a bad reason to get married, but I mean,
a couple of things we should point out about singleness too is that the New Testament really goes a long way towards sanctifying singleness as a possible God-pleasing vocation in life. Obviously, Jesus was single. He could have gotten married. He probably knew that if he did that, his kids would have a lot of hard times in life.
he did have children, didn't he?
Jesus didn't have biological children. He had brothers and sisters. Yeah. So he didn't get married, even if the Da Vinci Code wants to suggest Mary Magdalene was the one. Even the atheist Bible scholars say that that's nonsense. But anyway, Jesus was single long into his adulthood. He's 33 years old or so at the time of his crucifixion. And then, of course, you have the Apostle Paul, who he may have been previously married. N.T. Wright wonders if he either was married or if he had a betrothal that was dismissed once Paul went Christian. But in any case, Paul is single. And then you have things in the New Testament that go from, in Genesis, God says, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a companion. To now Paul saying, it is better to be single because if you're married, your interests are divided. But then he goes on and says, but get married if you want to get married, get married. Like it's better that than to sort of get inflamed with lust.
There's always singleness because I don't care how crowded your life is, how many friends you have, or anything else. There's this person, the soul. That's the singleness of every person there is. And you have to satisfy. If you don't love yourself, you can't love anybody else. That's part of being single. Well. You're a single person, but you're married. You're a single person, you have a family. I mean, you're the center of yourself, and sometimes you're the center for your family and everybody else. But it's that single person that has an influence in your life. That single person. It's not a crowd. There was a guy that was a real good preacher, kind of evangelist. And he said he was so busy, he couldn't get married because he didn't have time to be a husband. He was at Matt Cortland, the old Matt Cortland. He was a very good evangelist, very good at speaking, but he didn't have time because of his work.
I read an article, heard some news, I don't know, in the last month or 6 weeks about, of course, presidential candidates, those that would go through. And a few years ago, there was a gentleman who didn't make it clear to the candidacy for voting, but he was running in the primaries and he was single. And the question was, well, who would be first lady? How would we fill that role if we elect someone who is single? It doesn't work in our system.
That's funny. Yeah.
That was interesting because, that person is still in politics. It's interesting, but he tried to run for president, and that was a question. I remember his answer was, well, my sister will fill that role. We're very close. She can take on those projects. I hadn't even thought that that could be a dilemma, but it came up.
Judy,
But you know, you look back in history and look at the people in our history and even now who have vocations that they're committed to, that they need to fill that commission, that vocation the best they can. And most of them don't do very well in marriage. You know, I just read a book about 2 women doctors, the first women doctors in America. They never got married because they never wanted to give up their vocation in order to do those other things. And we have now made it a religion to find a soulmate, the one, and make this perfect life that doesn't include anything except that nuclear family. Then what happens to those vocations that we are committed to? And you know, you can make it, but that's the difference between what marriage was 100 years ago and what marriage is now. And we have these expectations of marriage that are totally unrealistic, that we have to find ways to be ourselves in the midst of that relationship and to be able to do the things we're called to do without always being totally responsible to another person, or they're going to be mad at us and divorce us. You know,
yeah, let's take that consideration and let's give soulmate the label law. The idea
Yeah.
of soulmate is law. And so now here's Paul Zoll's thesis for grace and marriage. He says, being known in weakness is the origin of marriage. It depends on a theology of the cross rather than a theology of glory. So if the law is to find a soulmate, obviously you got to be compatible, you got to be worthy, you got to measure up. But grace in marriage comes from the cross. It comes from being known in your weakness, being naked and unashamed in more ways than one. He says, then it's the grace origin of every marriage on which the future of the marriage depends. In trouble, you have to retreat to first principles. What was it like at the beginning? What created the spark that led to the promise? The light of being loved and loved in your humanity as opposed to your ideal or your ideality, which was the inaugurating son of this particular system. So grace coming from a theology of the cross as opposed to a theology of the glory of finding your soulmate. I talked about the archaeology and the baggage that we each bring into, anyone who's married brings into the marriage. He talks a lot about competition in marriage. Competition, primarily it happens around identity, although it's never actually a fight about identity. One thing I tell premarital couples, which comes from a book called Difficult Conversations, which is a business book from Harvard Business School, says every conversation has 3 levels. The first level is on the surface, and that is what happened. So you're fighting about somebody did or said or didn't do something, and you fight about what happened. But then the second deeper conversation is the feelings conversation. How actually whatever happened or didn't happen, how that made you feel. But the deepest part of the conversation, which we hardly ever get to because it's so difficult, is the identity conversation. That in the end, what grace has to address in a marriage and in many similar relationships is the identity question. Is you're not going to agree on what happened. And you can hear how you made your spouse feel, but you can't really know how it feels to be them day after day, sort of receiving what they receive. But can we try to perceive the identity that's at stake? That, you know, what happened is we fought about buying this toy for the kids. And how that feels is, well, I made a mistake in spoiling the kid. But what you're really saying is my identity is a bad father or mother. You know, not that they would actually say, yeah, I think you're a bad father or I think you're a bad mother, but we tend to, again, as original sinners and unfree people, we tend to take all the evidence of our life and sort of construct a story about who we are and who we think our family thinks we are and all that. And if we feel that like that is under threat, that identity is under threat, we come out scratching.
Communication is probably the biggest thing too, I think, in couples.
Mhm.
I think that breaks down more than anything. Because when you get married, it's just all just wonderful and everything's fine, but soon the honeymoon's over and you find out things that just aren't, and yet you don't want to talk about it probably. You think, oh, it'll go away. Well, it doesn't sometimes. So I think communication is a real.
Yeah, communication, absolutely. Yes, Jackie.
Just a quick thing, there's a book called It's Not About the Dishes. It's not about the kitchen. Because, you can have little spats about something, and Brian and I are little spatty things. We have to sing or go in the dishwasher. But that's not what it's about. There's always something deeper, like you say, just kind of, I don't feel like you're helping me out or something like that. So it's always kind of a good clue if you're kind of.
You're not listening to me.
Some little thing.
Zoll writes, grace nullifies competition in marriage. Grace says you are both equally at fault in everything because the fault is in your chemistry and in your head. Now, obviously, he's going to make exceptions if there's abuse, if there's infidelity. I mean, there are other kinds of problems, but marriages don't usually start with those problems. So he's going to make exceptions, which we would graciously have to do. But I do like that idea. The problem is not them. The problem is in your chemistry. It's like this third person in the marriage or something, this thing called a marriage. And it's in your head. It's actually, you're assuming a lot about what the other person thinks. And so it's in your head and it's in your chemistry. And again, he follows that statement up by saying, all of us are under the power of sin, which again goes back to that idea of how unfree we are when it comes down to it.
Well, there's a lot of bad things that happened before, there's a lot of bad things that happen now, but say 20, 30, 40 years ago, would there be a woman's space for women that were abused, for kids? No. So there's a lot of other things that have evolved that take care of now that we're not taking. People were expected to live with abusive husbands.
Yeah, right.
Etc. And then you didn't have women's live either.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole there's bad things and good things when you go forward.
Yeah.
There always will be. But then there's some bad things that have been taken care of too. But racism, I think it'll be with us forever.
Don't say that. That's hopeless.
Well, it's a matter of
It may, no.
that's just what I said.
That'll be a good conversation for the hallway. Yeah, because we just have a few minutes to wind a little further. Do you remember the old song called the Pina Colada song?
Oh, yeah.
This is before my time, but I looked up the lyrics. I know the
Did
song.
you love Pina Colada?
Yeah, that one. Do you remember what it's about?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe this is, so you and Paul Zoll probably went to high school together. But of course, the idea is grace is always going out in one direction towards the other. It's curious, it wants to know, it wants to understand. And the fun thing about this song, which if you don't know it, because I just thought it was about pina coladas.
Well,
But a husband and a wife each put an ad in the paper looking for someone. They're each trying to cheat on their spouse. If you like this, if you like this, yeah. And it turns out they end up like meeting each other at a bar and it's their spouse because they both like the same things and they never knew that the person liked all these things that they did because they had given up on exploring each other. Yeah. Well, if it only worked out like that all the time, but you shouldn't have to cheat on your spouse in order to save the marriage. That's just a song, right? I don't know. He says, he writes, the bond of marriage is forever unraveling and forever being rewoven. Because original sin is distributed evenly within husband and wife, every marriage is affected doubly. Without help from the outside, marriages go bad. A man and a woman are in constant process of withdrawal from one another. Part of you is longing to love and be loved. Part of you is dying to pull back and be alone. So maybe he says something that we admit is true for us, and maybe it's too much. He gives a funny example from Bette Midler about this applies to all of our relationships. We didn't cover this last week, but in talking about sort of the condition of a human, how we're sort of at the center of our lives. He says, just watch people in a conversation who aren't really listening to each other. They're just thinking of what they're going to say next. And if somebody says, you know, boy, I just got diagnosed with cancer, then the next thing the other person says is, oh yeah, I had cancer and it was the hardest thing. Let me tell you all about it. And it's hard to figure out how to relate to each other without overriding the other person. And so his Bette Midler example is, she is talking about herself, and then at the end she says, okay, enough about me. What do you think about me? And a lot of marriages end up like that. Okay, enough about me. Well, what do you think about me? Yeah. In terms of the word of the cross and grace in marriage too is, you know, you have to forgive your spouse for being who they are. And that sounds kind of funny. Like, I have to forgive Andrea for being a woman, and she has to forgive me for being a man. And for, like, thinking that we're going to think along the same lines or look at something from the same direction. Just like, as we'll talk about with kids next week, that a husband has to forgive his wife for being a mother, even though it's not a sin to be a mother. But still, there's something internally that says you have to have grace for the mother who has to devote her life to a newborn. And a woman has to, and again, this is kind of broken up into stereotypes for this example, but he says, you know, a man has to forgive his wife for being a mother, and a wife has to forgive her husband for having a career. You know, it never goes well at my house when I say, because I have a job. Like, that's never like a good reason or excuse for why I'm not, or, you know, doing something. I have a job, you know, that doesn't turn out well. And I have my own sins to confess on the other end. So I don't want to go too much further, but as we talk about marriage, we're going to talk a little bit more about how the law is sort of overcome by grace. You know, what's the bridge that gets us from law to grace? You know, what do we do in marriages when children come into the picture, become teenagers, leave the home, leaving us empty nesters? And what do we do, you know, as we age with our spouse? And how does that change the relationship? And oftentimes, and we have testimonies in this room, oftentimes, going back to the unfreedom of the human condition, oftentimes the marriage changes and it's neither person's, it's out of everybody's control.
Yeah.
Right. And you know what I'm talking about. And so how does grace create a bridge over that chasm of law, a bridge back to we find each other again and again and again through life's many varied changes?
Well, if we don't have grace, how do we get to do that?
Yeah. Well, that's the gift of being Christian, is that Tim Keller, he's a pastor in New York. He talks about it as what is it? Christians can be grace philanthropists because we've received more grace than we need. We need it all, but like, we've received so much grace upon grace from God that when our spouse or our friend or our parents don't give us the grace that is in proportion and we need, we have God's grace like to extend to them. And that's hard. I mean, that is really, that's really
Yeah,
hard.
because we're so in the moment.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's just like
Yeah.
brain freeze or something.
And we'll talk about grace between siblings either next week or maybe the third week, because we have so much good stuff to talk about. But what he actually says, in his career as a pastor, he's only seen sibling rivalry healed when one or both of the siblings either become a Christian or sort of have a spiritual reawakening. That only when one of the siblings actually comes to the cross is there hope for the repairing of the sibling relationship. Because in a marriage, I mean, you got to figure out if you're going to like live life together. With kids, you're always going to have a relationship with your kids, whether it's one of absence or whatever, estrangement or whatever. But with siblings, you can kind of wash your hands of them. It's like, go live your life. And that temptation is often taken on. We just say, okay. And that it actually takes somebody in the relationship absorbing the sin of the other and not passing it back. And saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
But
And-
as you have to know yourself, know thyself. If you don't know yourself, how can you be good? Focus on giving grace to somebody else. You got to know who you are. Are you a giver or a taker or who you are?
But
Then
that
you'll
comes
react.
late in life,
Huh?
doesn't it? It comes late in life.
Well, that's the trouble. It comes too late most of the time.
Yeah, so
Before you find out who you really are.
Yeah. So now the question is, how do we take Socrates, know thyself, and introduce Socrates to Jesus, which is, in the words of Martin Luther, true self-knowledge is to see yourself, is to see Christ wrapped up in your sins. That if you want to know who you are, you see yourself as the person whom Christ has taken on his sins and given him his righteousness, which both dignifies you as beloved of God, but it also says, I am going to always be at fault in my marriage and in my friendships and so forth.
Well, we're human, so we always can make mistakes. Some are sinful and some are.
Yeah, right.
Some are sinful.
Sure. Yeah. As long as true self-knowledge isn't sort of a modern, like, I'm just living my bliss, following my heart, doing what I do. Because that never works out on The Bachelor TV show. Everybody follows their hearts and they all break up. So, Jackie.
Yeah,
Well, in my experience, is that you can't just kind of stir up grace yourself, because it
Right.
is really a gift from God.
Right.
That he can put in your heart, and I know I've had to pray for grace, Lord, just give me grace, and it takes a lot of pressure off the human being then, but I don't have to do this on my own, Lord, you can heal me and help me.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think we've put a lot on the table, and so
Yeah, I want to hear more
Let's
about
think-
children and families.
yeah, let's keep thinking about these things and come next week. We'll continue to pick it up with marriage and introduce children into the equation. And again,
Marriage.
and then let's carry singleness throughout all the conversations, because you can be single in a marriage, right? So the loneliness of the human individual is an ongoing condition that we have to negotiate. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Come on back and appreciate it. Thanks, Mary and Judy, for tuning in. And yes, yep. Yeah. And Mary, send me your phone number if you would.
Can you give me a quick email or
Yeah.
something?
Yeah. Yep. Do you want it in the chat box or do you want me to just say it?
Oh, let me see if I can find, where am I here? Yeah, I think we can do that. I just have to get my screen. Okay, go ahead and see if that'll work.
Okay. I'll give you both. My church one is long because it's tom@BethesdaLutheranChurch.com.
Okay.
I also have tomlovestheducks@gmail.
Oops. There it is. Okay, I'll get it from there. Tom loves the ducks at Gmail. Oh, brother.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
I got it. Thanks.